Maureen is now our next speaker, and Maureen O'Hara. She's a feminist activist, a legal academic, and her research focuses on the sex trade. More recently, she's been researching the ways in which law and policy relating to gender identity are affecting sex-based rights of women and girls, which led to her co-drafting with myself and Sheila Jeffries, the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. She has worked in child safeguarding as a trainer, policy officer, and a solicitor.
I'm going to talk about gender ideology and the erosion of child safeguarding principles. Heather's already described gender ideology, really, so I don't need to say what I mean by it, except that very briefly what I'm talking about when I refer to it is the idea that social and legal definitions of what it means to be a man or a woman should be rooted in individual subjective feelings and not based on biological sex, which is the essence, really, of gender ideology. It's been promoted by very influential lobby groups, as Heather's already mentioned, and it's now, I think, becoming not just an ideology, but an orthodoxy, which is very dangerous for people, in certain professions anyway, to challenge. As with any orthodoxy, dissenters are punished and vilified. And people who leave the orthodoxy, in this case detransitioners, are also vilified. It's hardened into quite a totalitarian, in many ways, orthodoxy, and I think partly because of that, that fact has very serious implications for child safeguarding, because unwillingness to challenge the orthodoxy and the power of the orthodoxy, I think, is leading many people who work with children to abandon or suddenly lose sight of what they know to be good child safeguarding principles when it comes to dealing with children who've been labelled trans, and also when it comes to setting up environments which involve children who are labelled trans as well as children who aren't, and that they are basically going along with the demands of lobby groups and going along with this ideology in a way which is detrimental, I think, to child safeguarding. Just to start off, I said earlier that the Declaration was established because we wanted to reaffirm sex-based rights. And in international human rights law, historically anyway, there's been a very clear distinction between gender on the one hand and sex on the other. The definition of sex has been based on biology, the physical and biological characteristics that distinguish males from females. This is from the United Nations Women's Gender Equality Glossary. And they define gender as the roles, behaviours, activities and attributes that a given society at a given time considers appropriate for men and women. These attributes, opportunities and relationships are socially constructed and are learned through socialisation processes. They can change over geography, they change over time. They're not innate, in other words. It's sex which is innate, biology is innate, and gender that is socially constructed. But gender ideology, as Heather's already mentioned, turns that on its head. This is from a letter to The Lancet by a group of doctors last year, where they were criticising the treatment of children labelled as trans and arguing that there needed to be a significant improvement in how doctors and other professions responded to those children. And they said sex has a biological basis, whereas gender is fundamentally a social expression. Thus, sex is not assigned. Chromosomal sex is determined at conception and immutable. It can't be changed. A newborn's phenotypic sex, established in utero, merely becomes apparent after birth, with intersex being a rare exception. This is the approach to gender and sex from what is often portrayed as best international practice in relation to transgenderism. It's taken from a document known as the Yogyakarta Principles on the Application of International Human Rights Law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. These principles have nothing really to do with sexual orientation. They're another example of what Heather's already referred to, which is a strategic decision to link gender identity with sexual orientation in lobbying strategies in order to make it easier to convince people that these arguments about gender identity promote inclusion and are progressive. And what it says is gender identity is understood to refer to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experiences of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, which may involve, if freely chosen, modification of bodily appearance or function by medical, surgical or other means, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech and mannerisms. As of these principles have no formal status in law, they haven't been adopted by any countries, they haven't been adopted by the UN, but as I said, they're constantly referred to as demonstrating best practice. And basically they turn biological sex into a social construct and gender into an innate characteristic, which is what Heather's already referred to. By replacing the material realities of biological sex with the idea of gender identity, which has no material substance, that effectively dismisses or erases sex-based oppression faced by women and girls, and thereby undermines our sex-based rights. Girls and women experience high levels of sexual and physical violence, predominantly from men, who are also the majority of perpetrators of sexual abuse against boys. It's impossible to acknowledge and challenge this sex-based violence if we don't acknowledge that male and female are social categories based on biological sex and not on individual subjective feelings. The UN Convention to End Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW, recognises that discrimination against women is sex-based. And it also recognises that gender is made up of stereotypical roles which are detrimental to women and detrimental to women's equality. But this understanding is being undermined by the spread of gender ideology. There was a further addition to the Yogyakarta Principles in 2017, the plus 10. And Principle 31, it basically sets out the ultimate agenda in regard to definitions of sex and gender of gender ideologists. And what it says is that states shall ensure that official identity documents only include personal information that is relevant, reasonable and necessary as required by the law for a legitimate purpose, and thereby end the registration of the sex and gender of the person in identity documents such as birth certificates, identification cards, passports and so on as part of their legal personality. So the ultimate aim is the eradication of all social and legal markers which denote sex, by which point denoting gender will have become from their point of view not relevant, so they don't want any markers denoting either sex or gender. Everybody will essentially be marked with an X. And in the meantime, while sex or gender continues to be registered, what they are asking for is a quick, transparent and accessible mechanism that legally recognises and affirms each person's self-defined gender identity. And they go on to say there should be no eligibility criteria for a person to be able to self-define their gender, not based on age and not based on what they call psychomedical diagnosis, which essentially means that an adult who lacked mental capacity to understand the implications of changing their so-called gender identity in law would still be enabled to do so, because their ideal is that there should be no requirements, no prerequisites of any kind whatsoever, including in relation to children. Now, the Women and Equalities Committee carried out an inquiry into law and policy relating to gender identity, which published its findings in 2016, as probably everybody here will know. And they recommended self-declaration, which is the aim of the Yogyakarta Principles. In fact, they were told that the Yogyakarta Principles were best international practice, and they recommended that they be adopted, which is actually contained in the committee's report, which makes me think they probably haven't read them. but they're recommending them anyway. Now, there were a number of different written submissions to the inquiry, including submissions from the British Association of Gender Identity Specialists and the British Psychological Society, both of which stated that male sex offenders who claim to be transgender are often doing so as a means of seeking easier access to women and children in order to commit further sexual offences. And the British Association of Gender Identity Specialists described an ever-increasing tide of referrals of patients in prison serving long or indeterminate sentences for sexual offences, seeking to change their gender identity from male to female. And they said those men vastly outnumbered prisoners referred to them who weren't convicted of sexual offences. The inquiry report makes no reference to those submissions anywhere in the report. In regard to sexual offending by men who claim a female gender identity or transgender identity, Ministry of Justice figures published last year estimated that there were 125 long-term prisoners in the prison estate in England and Wales who claimed to be transgender, claimed to be trans women. 60 of the 125 were sex offenders, and of those 60, 29 had convictions for sexual offences against children. So where biological males claim that they are actually women and now are saying that they are literally women and always have been, as Heather's already discussed, that doesn't seem to have any effect on male patterns of sexual offending, which seem to be very similar amongst men who identify as having a female gender identity as they are amongst men as a wider category. So, recommendations for self-declaration and the whole of gender ideology is taking place within a world situation and within the situation domestically in this country, where there are very high levels of violence against women and children perpetrated overwhelmingly by males. So the World Health Organization, in fact, has described violence against women as a global health problem of epidemic proportions. They treat it as a public health problem, which is why they use that language. In 2013, they published research based on international data which suggested that 35% of women worldwide had experienced physical and or sexual violence from a male assailant. And in 2011, they published international data showing that around the world, if you look at the different research studies, they suggested that at least 20% of girls and 8% of boys had been sexually abused during childhood. Those are probably underestimates because of the difficulties in actually finding out information about sexual violence and the reluctance and fears that both children and adults have in reporting it. These are figures relating to child sexual abuse in England and Wales. The Ministry of Justice last year published criminal justice outcomes data showing that of 8,806 defendants in sexual offences trials for offences against children, 98% of defendants were male. And in 2017, police recorded data on child sexual exploitation, one form of child sexual abuse, recorded 6,107 offenders, of whom 93% were male. And all research which looks at the sex of perpetrators of the sexual abuse of children finds similar proportions, 90% plus in almost all data. And that isn't only sexual violence perpetrated by adult males. There is increasingly sexual violence perpetrated by boys against girls of similar ages, much of it taking place in school, and there's also very high levels of sexual harassment in school. This is taken from a Women and Equalities Committee report published at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018. The session was in 2016-17. I won't read all of the data out, but data published in September 2015 showed that 5,500 sexual offences had taken place in schools over a 3-year period leading up to the report, and that included 600 rapes. 59% of girls and young, these were large-scale studies. If you want the details of the studies and the whole numbers, there are links to them on the report online. 59% of the girls and young women interviewed for one study, aged 13 to 21, in 2014, said they faced some form of sexual harassment at school or at college in the previous year. 29% of 16 to 18-year-old girls had experienced some form of unwanted sexual touching. 22% of girls aged 7 to 12 had experienced jokes of a sexual nature from boys. A very high percentage of boys and girls report constant name-calling of girls, slut, slag, other abusive sexual terms being used towards girls in schools. 41% of girls in the UK who were in a UK study, aged 14 to 17, reported sexual violence from a sexual partner. And 28% of 16 to 18-year-olds have seen sexual pictures on their mobile at school. What the research also suggests is that schools are not responding adequately or appropriately to this high level of sexual harassment and violence. Often harassment in particular is minimised. The boys say, oh, it's just banter, miss, or it's just banter, sir, and the teacher will also describe it as just banter and avoid dealing with it. In relation to actual sexual assaults, there's evidence from a number of different studies that in many instances, while schools will report to the police, they don't take any further action themselves. And if the police don't prosecute, they don't do anything. And they often expect girls to stay in school with boys who've sexually assaulted them. There's been new guidance for schools on this, published this year and towards the end of last year, but it remains to be seen how effective that will be. So this is the context in which schools now are being encouraged, and some of them are going along with this, allowing boys who are self-defining as girls access to female-only spaces, toilets, changing rooms, sleeping facilities on residential trips. So despite the fact that the recommendation by the Women and Equalities Committee to introduce self-declaration in law has not been introduced, and the government has indicated recently they don't intend to introduce it, at least at the moment. De facto self-declaration in a number of public organisations, voluntary sector organisations, has been gradually introduced by stealth largely over the last several years. And it's happening in schools, hospitals, some rape crisis facilities, some refuges for women and children escaping domestic abuse. At any one time, roughly 2/3 of the residents in domestic abuse refuges are children. And some services are allowing males who identify as having a female gender identity access to services, and some are employing them as counsellors, as managers of domestic abuse services, and so on. Girl Guides, as I'm sure most of you know, allow not only self-declaration for boys who want to join Girl Guides on the basis that they're girls, they also allow volunteers who have males who have self-declared that they're women to work with girls, to go on residential trips with girls, and in some cases to provide intimate care to girls. Now, this orthodoxy is leading people to abandon everything they know about child safeguarding. We know, and we have known for decades, that sexual predators who are predators against children look for opportunities to get access to children easily. They're drawn to youth work, teaching, sports work with children, all sorts of areas of work with children. They choose that work because they want to sexually abuse the children. We know this, but yet Girl Guides allows men to self-identify as women and potentially provide intimate care to girls. And they don't tell parents that that is happening. So why has this come about? The law hasn't been changed to introduce self-declaration, but all sorts of organisations now are introducing it, including the police and the courts now. And how it's happened is by a process of policy capture, largely by lobby groups, the kinds of lobby groups that Heather mentioned. The OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, defines policy capture in this way. The process of consistently or repeatedly directing public policy decisions away from the public interest towards the interest of a specific interest group or person. Capture is the opposite of inclusive and fair policy making and always undermines core democratic values. The capture of public decisions can be achieved through a wide variety of illegal instruments, such as bribery, but also through legal channels, such as lobbying and financial support to political parties and political campaigns. Undue influence can also be exercised without the direct involvement of public decision makers by manipulating the information provided to them, giving them wrong information about the law, for example, which has happened. It's contained in Stonewall documents, Mermaids documents, all sorts of lobby groups are giving inaccurate information about the Equality Act, or establishing close social or emotional ties with them. There's an academic called Horrocks who's talked about the way in which people who are seen as experts and who provide consultancy to organisations can capture policy because so much belief is invested in their expertise by people who don't understand the subject area very well that they're dealing with. That creates a power imbalance between the people commissioning consultancy and the people giving the consultancy. And I think that's happened in this area. People are confused about transgenderism. They're not quite sure exactly what it is. Many people don't understand the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity. They want to be inclusive. They want to promote equal opportunities. They're not quite sure about all of this, so they listen to what the people they think are the experts. And that, I think, is how a lot of lobby groups who do provide training and consultancy have brought about this policy capture that's taken place in a range of different organisations in the last several years. Just as an example of how much money is being spent on consultancy, in the last 5 years, universities in the UK have spent £1 million on consultation from Stonewall. And the results, I think, can be seen in some university policies. Now, I talked about gender ideology being an orthodoxy, and I think this case, family law case concerning a 7-year-old boy called Reed J, illustrates that very well. And the way in which the orthodoxy can lead people to abandon their normal practices, professional practices in child safeguarding, and lose sight of what they already know about child safeguarding. The case concerned a 7-year-old boy who was in effect having a female gender identity imposed on him. His mother had convinced herself that he was actually a trans girl, and this had been happening between the ages of 4 and 7 when the final decision in the case was made. The judge stated that local authority children's services consistently failed to take appropriate action where it should have been clear to them that the child was at risk of significant emotional harm. And he suggested that this was because the social workers did not wish to appear to be challenging an emerging orthodoxy in such a high-profile issue. He made a complaint about what had happened to the director of children's services in that particular local authority. He was so concerned about it. Now, the issue in the case was not just that the child was having a trans identity imposed on him. It was also that he had been taken out of school. He had been stopped from playing with other children on the basis that they would bully him because he was trans. His mother disappeared with him at a certain point, and his guardian in the legal proceedings, which is basically usually a trained social worker who represents a child's interests in certain types of proceedings, wasn't able to contact him or his mother. The child's solicitor wasn't able to contact him. Nobody knew where he was. They didn't know where he was living. He was the subject of legal proceedings. He was living a completely isolated life, not going to school, not being educated. whether or not that child was trans or labelled trans, that should have raised all sorts of alarm bells for a social worker, for a child safeguarding social worker. They should have taken much more decisive action at a much earlier stage with any child who was being treated in that way and isolated in that way. But they didn't. And the reason for that, I think, is because the child was labelled trans. With another child, they would have taken firmer action. So gender ideology is harmful to children labelled trans, not only because the transitioning harms them, but because people lose sight of other safeguarding concerns when dealing with children labelled trans, because they're scared of the orthodoxy, they're scared of challenging it. And they're scared for good reasons. I think it's not just because they're scared, people are confused, they want to be kind to children who've been labelled trans, they want to be kind to trans people, they want to be inclusive, but they're also very frightened. Because the response when people do challenge this ideology is to label them as bigots, label them as transphobes, and people have lost their jobs for challenging this ideology. People have lost their jobs for saying men can't literally become women. And people know this, and they are frightened to challenge it, and that fear is interfering with professional practice and is causing an erosion, I think, of safeguarding practices. I'm just going to look briefly at these two proposed policies on the use of toilets, showers, changing rooms and sleeping facilities in schools. One of them is published by the Trans Inclusion Toolkit, and one of them is the Trans Inclusion Toolkit, published by All Sorts Youth Project, and the other one is a draft document which has been leaked, published by the Equality and Human Rights Commission in relation to Scotland, and its guidance for schools on the Equality Act 2010 in relation to trans pupils. In regard to what are traditionally single-sex spaces, they make very similar recommendations, which is that a child who's been labelled trans should have access to the toilets, changing rooms and so on, which correspond with their gender identity. So in other words, a boy should have access to the toilets and so on of girls. The All Sorts guidance says pupils and students are supported through the Equality Act to access the toilet that corresponds to their gender identity. So trans girls, because they are girls, can use the girls' toilets, and trans boys the boys' toilet. That is not true. That is a complete misrepresentation of the Equality Act. There are exceptions in the Equality Act by which single-sex spaces can be maintained, and they can be maintained in schools. They go on in a similar vein in relation to changing rooms and sleeping facilities. The only situation in which they recommend that it might not be appropriate for a trans pupil to use the sleeping facilities that align with their gender identity is if they're not comfortable with it. But if other children are not comfortable with it, that's not an issue. The Equality and Human Rights Commission makes essentially the same recommendations, but it's a little bit more accurate about the law. So it says, if a school adopts a policy that all pupils must use the facilities of the sex that was recorded at birth, they should be aware that this could amount to indirect discrimination against a trans pupil, so they must show in each case that the decision is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. Now that is true, but they're discussing it from the perspective that the starting point should be inclusion on the basis of gender identity. And in their guidance, they say about child safeguarding, in view of their statutory remit, the guidance does not and cannot deal with all considerations that schools need to take into account, such as safeguarding. So they can make recommendations that children should use toilets, etc., on the basis of gender identity, but they're not taking into account safeguarding at all. That's for somebody else to do. All right. I'm going to skip the next part about the Trans Inclusion Schools Toolkit because I think you've got the idea. I just want to talk briefly about another area in which child safeguarding is being eroded, very significantly eroded. In this case, in relation to very small children, preschool children and primary age children predominantly, which is drag queen story time. Now, some of the men who are involved in drag queen story time identify as gay, some describe themselves as transgender. And they dress in drag, they read stories to children. This is taken from the LGBT consortium in the UK, and they say the aim of drag queen storytime is to capture the imagination and fun of the gender fluidity of childhood, while giving children a glamorous, positive and unabashedly queer role model. Now by queer, they don't mean lesbian or gay. They're not reclaiming the word queer in a positive way to refer to lesbians and gay men. They are using it in the sense of queer theory, which means any sexuality which is transgressive, or gender identity which is transgressive, is queer. So the toolkit from All Sorts says lessons about transgenderism in schools will not confuse children about their gender identity. It's only children who already know they're trans who will be affected by it, and they'll be positively affected by it. Other children will not be confused. And the claim is made that there isn't an intention to inculcate gender fluidity or to encourage children down the path of adopting a new gender identity. I think this illustrates that in many cases that's not the case. I'm over time, I think, so I'll leave it there. Do you want to?
Okay, we've got 10 minutes of question time.
If people don't want to be filmed, can you let me know in advance? Otherwise, we've been asked to get people's reactions. That's okay.
I saw this person's hand first.
Thank you ever so much for bringing up Drag Queen Story Time. I look after children preschool, and I've lost lots of inverted commas friends because I told them that Drag Queen Story Time was inappropriate for them to take children who they haven't got consent to take to Drag Queen Story Time. They thought that it was about being inclusive. And I pointed out to them that how does Drag Queen Story Time represent LGB? It's not about that, it's about the tea. And it's ever since the tea has become involved that LGB has suddenly been promoted. And yet LGB is the basis of common decency, I think, in society. And suddenly we've got to now accept the tea. And I just find it so frustrating that women who are supposed to be aware of safeguarding children as paramount in their practice think that it's more important to promote the prevent duty. That was the wording of one of the women that I thought was intelligent. She thought prevent was more important than safeguarding. She thinks that preventing children from being bullied for being trans is paramount. I've lost a lot of local friends who work in the same thing as me. So thank you for making it part of the talking point.
I think it's really... yeah, I mean, I'm puzzled by the fact that parents take their tiny children to Drag Queen Story Time. And drag is basically a caricature of a female sexual stereotype. It's often highly sexualised. That's probably toned down in Drag Queen Story Time, but it's still there as an undercurrent. Again, it's about trying to be woke, trying to be inclusive, and not wanting to be seen as transphobic. And when people do criticise it, that is the response. You're a bigot, you're a transphobe, or you're a homophobe, depending on the particular performers involved. And they see it as harmless fun, but in fact, or some people do, but in fact I don't think it is. And I think it is part of this spread of this ideology and an orthodoxy, not just an ideology, that I've been talking about. And that's why people won't challenge it.
Can I just say that I think one of the things that we've got about drag queen story time in this country is because we've got this tradition of pantomime. Because we've got this tradition of pantomime in Britain. So most of us have taken our children to see pantomimes where we have the dame who seems funny and fairly harmless until you actually think about it, and of course it isn't. So I think a lot of people see drag queen story time as just a sort of carry on from pantomime. And I think that might be one of the reasons why in America it's perhaps looked on as slightly more astonishing when this sort of thing happens down in Britain.
I think you're right, but I also think that it's quite, I mean, I think a lot of the pantomime dame performances are very questionable when you look at what they're actually portraying to children. But there's a distance. They're on stage, there's a lot of other different characters. It's part of a general play, if you like, a pantomime. And it's not so intense as children being with one or two drag queens, sometimes more, where the drag queens are completely in control of what's happening, and it's a much more direct experience, and also it has a much clearer agenda behind it, which is to encourage so-called gender fluidity in children. That's what some organisations are saying they're doing. So yes, I can see why people think it's just like a pantomime dame if they don't think about it too much. But I think you're right about that, and I think that needs to be challenged.
I'm a teacher in Birmingham and have been fighting against all sorts of this nonsense for a while. Particularly within my union, who are promoting the No Outsiders programme, and Birmingham Local Authority have signed up to the Trans Toolkit, and I don't know whether anyone's interested in knowing, I sent a Freedom of Information request to Birmingham City Council to ask if they had done any equality impact assessment before signing up to it, and I'm afraid to say the answer was no. They just fully adopted it without any consideration of how it would impact on girls and female staff in their schools. So that's just a bit of a...
I think that's happening in a lot of local authorities, and a lot of them have either adopted the Brighton Toolkit or they've created a variation of it. They've used it as their base.
There's about 3 or 4 that it's based on the Trans Toolkit from Brighton, but it's Oxford and Warwickshire and Birmingham have all adopted a sort of similar one. It's horrific.
Yes, so going back to the beginning of your presentation, Maureen, talking about the Untitled principles, I think one of the things that happened, and I think it happened by stealth, and I think Stephen Whittle was a big driver behind it, is that they got the Council of Europe to adopt the Untitled principles. And I think all the legitimacy for them and the definitions that they use, gender expression, etc., gender identity, I think in a way that's where the legitimacy is flown from. So I wonder, is anyone in the Women's Declaration group working on that at that level? Because all the groundwork we're doing is absolutely vital and necessary, and is hugely important. But it would be reassuring to know if someone was working at that more structural international level.
We will be working, or we're hoping to work, put it that way, at international level, and we have got, we're discussing how to do that. And it's at this point, I don't think it's appropriate, or that I could say any more about it than that, because it's still in discussion.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
I thought it was really, really clear, extremely alarming presentation, Maureen, so thank you very much for that. So the connections between drag queens and prostitution are really, really, really clear. So, as you say, nobody seems to be asking lesbians to pop in and talk to children. We've also got internationally something very, very organised. In all the English-speaking world, drag queen story time is taking place in libraries, in galleries. We have to ask, how did this organisation happen? How did these ideas penetrate? How does the networking take place? Because it's a most extraordinary situation. But I think we also need to look at the role of drag in gay culture, which helps to prevent gay men actually taking this seriously. It's very much a part of gay culture, a part of gay psyche, because of the way men and boys grow up, unable to be masculine, finding themselves gay, treating womanhood as a default category, and so on. And many of them have been sexually abused, so their possibility of being men, as it were, is destroyed by that. So we have to have an understanding of the role of drag, why it's in gay culture, why it's in gay psyche, and we have to oppose it. So just doing drag queen story time on its own, unfortunately, isn't going to be enough for us in the end.
I think in the end it's probably true, yes. And on the subject of the backgrounds of the men doing it, there are at least 2 in the United States, in Texas, who've actually been found to be child sex offenders. They've got convictions. And the cover it will attract sexual predators, there's no doubt about that, who have an interest in children. But yes, but at the moment I'm quite focused on the story time, but I agree with what you're saying, essentially. Who's the next person?
Could I just say, I'm so sorry. We're going to very strictly stay on time, and I'm getting instructions from the front here that I've got to stick very strictly with it.
Can you have one more question or not?
Apparently we can't have one more question. No, we can't. No.
Okay.
It's her fault, not my fault. Thank you very much.